Hello and welcome to the third webinar in our new Essentials of Fleet Safety webinar series. The Essentials of Fleet Safety is a series of 5 60-minute webinars to give champions the essential elements of running a fleet safety programme. The webinars are based on the 5 strands of Global Fleet Champions, and today's webinar focuses on the Incident Analysis and Intervention strand and is sponsored by Verizon Connect. Global Fleet Champions is a partnership campaign administered by BRIC, the road safety charity, to prevent deaths, injuries and pollution caused by vehicles driven for work. To learn more about the campaign and what we do, please visit globalfleetchampions.org. At today's webinar, you will learn how to write an annual safety plan with key performance indicators for collisions and emissions. In addition, we will discuss methodologies for collecting data, as well as pre and post-crash analysis techniques. On your screen now, you should be able to see a multiple choice question poll, so we can find out your views on this topic. It is anonymous, simply select one answer and press submit, and we will discuss the results at the beginning of the Q&A session, which is your opportunity to ask some of today's presenters any questions you might have. You can put forward your questions at any time during the webinar by using the chat box on the webinar panel. Thank you for your time, and the webinar will now begin.
So hello everybody, and first of all, thank you for BRIC for inviting me to share my thoughts on what the implications of a crash are, but perhaps more importantly, what you can learn from them to help improve your fleet safety performance as part of your wider risk management program. And that latter point is quite an important one. We should never look at any single thing in isolation. We need to look at the implications in the wider risk management program, and I'll talk more about that later when it comes to post-collision issues. So what are the implications of crashes? Well, that's going to depend on the severity and the exact nature of the crash, but it's likely to include some of the following things. So if you take your corporate social responsibility seriously, and I hope that you do, then clearly when a serious collision occurs, if your drivers are injured, then that's an issue, but perhaps a bigger issue is if third parties, people who you share the road with, are injured. And that's especially true of vulnerable road users, pedestrians, cyclists, motorcyclists, who make up roughly 50% of the killed and serious injury statistics around the world. If one of those is injured, then that's going to adversely affect your corporate social responsibilities. Most organizations tend to focus on the environmental issues, and sometimes they overlook the road safety implications. But there's also the legal implications. Depending on where in the world you're operating and where the collision occurred, you may face prosecution if the prosecuting authorities think that your management or operational systems have contributed to the crash occurring. But if we're being honest, most organizations are motivated by money. Now, the International Loss Control Institute say that for every pound, euro or dollar that an insurer pays out, there's 8 to 53 pounds, euros or dollars in uninsured losses, depending on the severity of the incident. 8 to 53 times. That's a phenomenal multiplier. Now think about how many vehicles you've got, how many crashes there occur, the sorts of costs associated with them, and do the maths for your fleet. Now I tend to use a more conservative 2 times multiplier of the claims costs, because that gives a more realistic and more perhaps believable in the boardroom figure. But even then, if you know your claims cost, just double those. That's going to be a big number in your organization. And remember, we're talking about claims costs here, which sort of implies that we're talking about fleet, but when a grey fleet driver is involved in a collision, there's going to be uninsured losses associated with the collisions that they're having. It's still a financial implication. So what are those uninsured losses? What are those hidden costs? Well, it's going to depend on the exact nature of your business, but it could include late deliveries, lost production, missing your service level agreements and the financial implications of that. Reputational damage, and that's especially true if you operate liveried vehicles or whenever the press get involved after a serious collision. The cost of replacement vehicles, increased administration costs, the list goes on and on. Usually, however, the biggest hidden cost is absenteeism. The person involved in the crash is not productive from anything from a couple of hours to days, weeks or months, depending on the severity of the incident, whether they were injured in that collision, and also, and some people overlook the importance of this, whether they've been psychologically damaged by the crash, and that's especially true if one of those vulnerable road users has been injured. Never underestimate that. And when you start to look at the implications of absenteeism, it gets easier to justify that 8 to 53 multiplier, or that 2 times multiplier of the claims cost. So those are the implications. But going back to the title of the session, what can we learn? Well, I said at the beginning, it's important to look at this in the wider context of your overall risk management program. And this is what a proven risk management program will look like. And when we're talking about what can we learn, we're looking at the bottom right quadrant in the plan, do, check, act process. We're looking at the check process, looking at the data, looking at post-incident reviews, and most importantly, looking at root cause analysis. But as I said earlier, there's implications even if we're just looking at this one area, because what we learn from this process can actually dictate how we act. It can change our policies, it can change our procedures, it can change our manager training. There's implications all around this ongoing risk management process. Let's start with data analysis. What can you learn from the data that you already have? And typically this would be your claims data from your perhaps leasing company, from your insurer, from your insurance broker. Well, what you can learn will depend on the level of detail, but perhaps you can find out who is having crashes, where those crashes are occurring, and perhaps more interestingly, which departments and which managers are overrepresented in those statistics and are having higher incident rates. But, and this is a really crucial point, it's not going to allow you to get down to the root cause of why those collisions occurred. So let me give you an example that will illustrate this. So in terms of the combination of highest frequency and highest cost, typically the number one type of collision will be hitting third party in rear, or to put it in another way, one of your drivers is driving into the back of another vehicle. If we look at some of the reasons why that might have occurred, the driver could be driving too fast, too close, they could be distracted, they could be fatigued, they could be impaired, there could be a vehicle defect. It's a long list of possible reasons. And then when we add to that some of the management and operational reasons why have meant that the driver is exhibiting behaviours that have led to that collision, then we've got a whole long list of possible underlying root causes. And by just looking at that data on that claims form or your claims history, you're not going to know why the collision occurred. As such, the most important thing, and not a lot of companies do this, but the most important thing is to have a post-incident review process in place. And this is one where the employees manager will conduct a thorough debrief with them to understand, was it just down to plain old bad driving, or was there something at a management or operational level that has led to that collision occurring? Now, we haven't got time to go into the depth of those incident reviews would look like, or indeed the level of training that a manager would require, but suffice to say, it's a really important part of the process and something that I encourage everyone to implement, because without it, you're not going to understand the root cause of the collision. And the most important question to ask yourself is, what have we done as an organization that may have contributed to that collision occurring? It's a very difficult question to ask, but probably the most important one that you will ask. So assuming that you have understood the underlying root cause, then well, what do you do next? How do you determine what the appropriate intervention is? And again, I return to sort of proven health and safety techniques here, using what we call the hierarchy of control. So once you've identified the root cause, you ask yourself the question, well, what can I do to eliminate it? If I can't do that, what can I do to substitute it for something of a lesser risk? And if I can't do that, what can I do to reduce the risk? So let me illustrate that with an example as well. So if you've done your post-incident review process effectively, and you've determined that actually the person was speeding at the time of the collision to make sure that they completed a job on time, then the best intervention will be to actually look at your operational metric that the driver was trying to achieve and modify that so that the next time they're faced with that situation, they can achieve their operational metric by driving safely and not having to take risks. It's easy to say, well, actually, when someone's been involved in a collision, well, let's give them some training. But unless you understand that underlying root cause, especially if that underlying root cause is something at a management or operational level, then training isn't the answer. It may be part of the answer, but unless you're making those operational and management changes, then that driver and other drivers similar to them are at risk of being involved in a collision. So to sum up what we've just gone through very briefly, we've looked at the implications of when a crash occurs. in terms of your damaged corporate social responsibility, especially related to injuries to vulnerable road users, the potential legal implications of the crash, depending on where you're operating and where the crash occurs. But most importantly, it's those uninsured losses, those hidden costs, especially related to absenteeism, that are going to have a serious financial implication on your organization. Analyzing your collision data can give you some useful insights, especially related to variations between departments and managers. But to really understand the underlying root causes of why a collision occurs, then you have to have some sort of post-incident debrief process conducted by managers and as soon as possible after the incident has occurred. Now, once you understand those underlying root causes of the crash, then you can determine, well, what do we do next? What's the appropriate intervention? With anything that you can do at a management or operational level, taking precedence, because that's much more likely to give you a sustainable reduction in your risk profile. Always use the hierarchy of control process to determine what the appropriate intervention is. Asking yourself, can we eliminate the risk? And if we can't do that, can we substitute for a low risk alternative? And if we can't do that, can we reduce the risk? And if you do that effectively, then that should see your collision rate coming down year on year on a sustainable basis. And remember, the most important question to ask yourself is, what have we done as an organization that may have contributed to that collision occurring? It's the most important question to ask, and also the most difficult. Thank you very much for listening, and safe driving.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim Noble, Vice President of Risk Engineering for edriving, and I'm delighted to be presenting this part of the webinar today. edriving is a global provider of driver risk management programs, and our solutions help organizations in a wide variety of industries and environments to significantly reduce the personal and financial consequences of motor vehicle crashes, and we steer them on a path of measurable continual improvement. I'm very aware I don't want this presentation to be a commercial for edriving, but any successful improvement plan is heavily reliant on a proven plan, do, act model. And the graphic on this slide shows that our techniques and tools are no different. An annual written plan must be based on a strategic master safety plan. Think of it this way. This is your macro strategic plan. The annual written plan that we're going to talk about will be your micro yearly plan to reach short-term goals and objectives on your journey towards your macro objectives. I must stress one point here. Before starting any continuous improvement plan or jumping onto the improvement roundabout, there are several imperative prerequisites that we're going to talk about that you must think about. First is your starting point. And what are your pain points? And what do you want to accomplish? But we believe that the most important prerequisite is management support, and that no program will be successful if it's not supported by leadership at all levels within the organization. This is a business priority. Now, not every manager in your organization will consider the changes required. In fact, more often than not, most leaders are happy with the status quo around fleet management and accept that their risk profile is normal. Here's your worst case scenario. It's a conversation around the water cooler. Hey, driving is a risky business, but we're doing okay. We're no different than anyone else. There's nothing else we can really do. We hire skilled drivers. That's your worst nightmare. When change is required, leadership support must make all the difference, and you must have it within your organization. So let's talk about the components of an annual safety plan. The micro plan, or the annual written safety plan, is traditionally a compilation of company policy and regulatory compliance documents. The minimum requirement for any plan is to meet the local, state, and overall government requirements. Regulatory compliance dictates how some programs should be developed. In a formal risk manager training program, annual safety plans are normally targeted at high hazard parts of the business. Things like chemical exposure and confined space. Today, we're going to broaden that scope to include fleet. We all know that this can be a high hazard area. However, the basics of fleet and high hazard development is the same. Do you have clear documented list of objectives that are quantifiable, such as cost of ownership, injuries, staff turnover, injury and insurance premiums, metal costs, things of that nature? Do you have an accurate database of incidents with a clear, concise, and well-communicated method of incident and data capture? You also need to have a clear, concise, and well-communicated investigation process that records causal factors in a consistent manner. And you'll need to log these learnings and keep track of the repeat occurrence mitigation actions that have risen along the way. Moving into planning of your annual safety plan. First, let's assess your current state. Do you have a good understanding of where your organization is at now, both in terms of driving and risk culture and statistically? Sometimes at this stage, it helps to have a second set of eyes to determine what are your pain points. Next, assess your pain points, or in other words, do a thorough risk assessment. You also may want to consider the tools you use. Do you have gaps in those tools? Do you have adequate internal tools, or do you need to reach out to a third party to help you develop what those tools should be? Do you have a consistent method of data capture? Do you have a consistent method of crash causation analysis? Are your data capture tools consistent and available, and are the people trained to use them? Does your company accept change easily, or do you need to have a major change management effort? Now that you've determined where you are, or what work you have to do to determine what tools you have, you need to determine your end state objectives. What are the key performance indicators from your macro plan that you're going to focus on to measure results in your micro plan? Finally, can the consequences be consistently and without subjectivity classified into levels of severity? Now, of course, all of these activities require a high degree of documentation, both for your internal use and to document a duty of care in case of prosecution. The do stage of your annual plan should look something like this. The first step will depend entirely on your starting point. If you don't have consistent methods of data capture and a culture that will not accept change, that could be your ground zero. That could be your first annual plan. But in any plan, you need to determine who's responsible for the plan at all levels. What are the action steps? Know where you are every step of the 1,000-step journey, and be prepared to defend your approach, your progress to date, and the quantitative risk reduction, money that you've saved the company, and more importantly, the lives that you've saved. Also, when are actions and results expected? How will the results be monitored at the front line? Let's talk about the next step. The next step is communication. And again, this depends on your company's level of acceptance of change. It is said that no seed grows on unprepared soil. For the annual plan to be successful, you have to prepare your organization. What are the elements of the program? When is the program coming? Why is it coming? An effective way to structure a communication is for the first communication to come from senior management, stating their commitment to the program. The second communication can come from the technical staff at the middle management, talking about the elements of the program. And the final stage comes from frontline management. Also, if possible, recruit one or more champions throughout your organizations that are subject matter experts and coaches. Launch. Okay, this is a different topic altogether from the annual written plan, but no plan can survive without actually putting it into action. So launch becomes very important, but it's not a topic for me for today. Data capture. As I stated earlier, how you capture and display your data matters. Can you aggregate your data at all sources and bring them into one place? Normalize the data and develop a clear, concise communication plan around the information. What are you going to measure? Injuries per million miles, cost per million miles, motor vehicle records. Many of these are lagging indicators, and they are relatively meaningless unless you have visibility into the leading indicators that are causing them. Leading indicators can be numbers of trainings delivered, current risk assessment based on psychometrics and driver history. It can be things like such as near misses or hazards in your fleet route planning, those types of things. If your data capture is well advanced and your culture is accepting, the next challenge may be what is the upgrade in technology to help you have better visibility into these areas, or better visibility into the vehicle itself. Okay, let's get into weeds for a short time here. When we talk about developing KPIs or key performance indicators, many people ask, how do I develop the formulas I need to measure my KPIs? Well, the short answer is you probably don't have to. The example on the screen is from our friends at International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. This illustrates what they call motor vehicle crash rates. You may use CPMM, or crashes per million miles, or crashes per 100 hours worked. As I said before, you may measure insurance costs or mental costs. Whatever works for your organization and gives total visibility into your annual plan. For leading indicators, you may want to measure coaching sessions or e-learnings completed, but you definitely want to measure driver behavior. It's the major leading indicator into giving you visibility into future crash causation. The point is, no matter what you measure, you can find help with organizations such as Brake and others. And of course, you can always contact us here at edriving. Again, from IAOG, here's an example of how you may want to rank your crash events. Remember, measurement and analysis of events is a huge part of your annual safety plan, and everyone in your organization has to understand the methodology of how it's being done. The last step is benchmarking. How many of you think benchmarking means comparing yourself to other like fleets? While this is very useful, it's not the most important benchmark of your annual safety plan. Your most important benchmark of your annual safety plan is to benchmark against your plan. Did you achieve your end state objectives? What are the areas that are lacking? What do you need to improve? And by the way, when you answer those questions, just like magic, you have the beginning of next year's plan. Good examples of written plans for fleet operators are very hard to come by. If you follow the stages that I've outlined in these last slides, you can create your own plan very easily. But if you need help with structure or content development, please feel free to contact me either through Brake or with my contact information on the following slide. Thank you for listening, and please enjoy the rest of the webinar.
Good afternoon. First and foremost, I'll introduce myself. I am Gary Taylor. I am the managing partner of our kind of product over at Verizon Connect in the UK and Ireland. Today, I'm going to be running through a bit of a presentation about utilizing telematics data to reduce risk within fleets. So really kind of sort of jumping through, first and foremost, I'm really going to sort of fire through the data types, how to use that data to your benefit, direct and indirect impacts to your fleet, and then I'm sure there's going to be some Q&A towards the end of this as well. So jumping straight into the nuts and bolts of things, data types. Realistically, you have two types, which is one that's proactive and one's reactive. And really simply, in the proactive side of things, you've got things like driving behaviours, real-time alerting of key incidents, service and maintenance, and tachograph, which kind of both fall in the compliance area as well. And then obviously on the flip side, you have the reactive, and that's things like route replay or kind of journey replays, and then also SD camera footage as well. So essentially all of these here are designed or in place as data points to reduce things like fuel consumption, on the road incidents, vehicle wear and tear, speeding, and then obviously things like compliance fines and claims as well. Kind of covering off the data types, I'm going to talk through actually those key data points, how we use them, how we kind of sort of throw them out there as well, and really what you can do with them behind it as well. First and foremost, you have reactive data points, things like your route replay. Most often it's used for speeding incidents just to kind of reconfirm, telematics data, have they actually committed that particular incident, and almost reconfirming that. It does highlight poor driving behaviours, and it also allows you to pose the question, are there reoccurring or ongoing issues with a particular driver or a particular group of people as well. In addition to that, as you can see on the right hand side, you have kind of a couple of snapshots of our or Verizon Connect camera functionality. Now, first and foremost, camera recordings are really, really useful after incidents to show footage. I.e. what's happened, how it's happened, etc., etc. Okay. Now, you can turn reactive into proactive with camera footage. Now, our latest launch of this particular product, essentially what it does, takes a harsh driving event or an incident, whether that's braking, cornering, harsh acceleration, and it auto records both pre and post that event. Once it does that recording, fires it straight back to the actual software package. So you have the ability to watch these events, almost learn and use this as driver feedback to be able to say, we've got a specific driver that has regularly braked hard when coming into roundabouts. You can use this footage to help coach, train, and progress that as well. So not only can cameras be reactive, but as long as you kind of use the right technology, you can push it into to proactive as well. Okay. With that really comes my favorite element, really why I joined Verizon Connect as a company 3 years ago, is actually how do we become proactive with data, and how do we use that to our advantage to reduce risk on the road and also reduce our operational cost as well. First and foremost, driving behaviours. Now I can see here I have 3 graphs on my screen. Now we have kind of a dashboard that allows organizations to really identify key trends or key analysis. And you can see things like hard braking, fast acceleration, aggressive cornering, and speeding. Now, really, really quickly, as a one-click broad overview, I'm able to see particular challenges in my fleet. Now, I've got several thousand drivers on my account here, but really quickly I can see I've got probably 9 drivers just in the top there that are below my threshold. Now, rather than focusing on all of my couple of thousand drivers, I can really put my time and attention into those drivers who actually need the support, help, and ultimately reduce my risk on the road. Same principle with the harsh driving. Really quickly I can identify individual drivers who have got issues. At the same time, I can identify really, really quickly what that issue actually is. And I'm going to take my guy here who drives vehicle FD333 on the top right-hand corner, has a lot of quick starts and hard braking. So, I can use this information and data to coach that driver into better performance on the road. Then we shuffle into real-time alerts, creating specific alerts for key incidents. Now, this just isn't about driving behavior and kind of risk on the road. It can also work for things like lone workers. So we can set a mile-an-hour alert. Let's say a high-speed event over 70 miles an hour. I need to be notified at any particular point in time that happens. Bang, we can create that, notify you via email, push notification, and a text message if you need to. Target all road speeds, so not just relating to the 70 mile an hour your motorway driving, but also your 30, your 40, your 50s, and your 60s. Has there been a speeding incident? As organisations, we are responsible for the way our vehicles are driven, especially when they're driven, sign written out on the roads as well. But you can also do things like, and I mentioned about lone working. You can alert on vehicle inactivity. If you've got a driver that's out on their own out in the sticks, you can also notify of if that vehicle should move at least once every 2 hours. If it hasn't moved every within 2.5 hours, bang, you can be notified, so you can check in with that driver and make sure nothing's gone wrong as well. So it not just works for the fleet risks, also the actual overall business risks as well. Shuffling along, service and maintenance, a huge one in terms of the area of compliance here. Create automated reminders for your MOTs, your time-based reminders, once every year, once every 2 years, or mileage servicing as well. Notify me, every 17,000 miles that my service is due every 18,000. gives you that little buffer to be able to say, right, I'm going to make sure my vehicles are fully compliant from an MOT perspective, but also fall in line with the actual kind of manufacturer's compliance as well. You can log vehicle maintenance costs within, and again, within the Verizon Connect platform, you certainly can do that, which gives you a history. You can, go back and see, you've got one particular vehicle that's costing you loads in maintenance. Maybe that's a good way to say, do you know what, we can off-fleet this vehicle and get in a new one because it's just costing us too much money. Alternatively, you can talk to the driver about their driving behaviour and see if that ties in and marries up. Not only can you do it, notify yourselves, but notify the drivers, notify the administration, also notify a garage if you use a local garage as well. So very, very useful tool to automate this process and stop relying on drivers out on the road to say, just so you know, my service is coming up for due. And setting reminders in advance of services. Now, one point I will make is this isn't just specific for vehicles. This is also used a lot with plant and machinery, especially when we're looking at things like engine hours and engine hour servicing. So again, tying into the compliance element and also ultimately the risks. Lastly, probably the biggest area of compliance we've seen a huge increase in conversation around is tachograph. Having the ability to automatically download your tachograph data, both driver and vehicle, automatically well within the compliance deadlines. So we look at this every 7 days for drivers and automatically download every 28 days for vehicles. You also have the ability to alert on specific infringements in real time. If you know a driver is coming up to his 4.5-hour driving limit for that particular stint, can notify you. It gets you ahead of the game rather than reacting to that a week or 2 weeks down the line when you're putting in your DDT files for the analysis to be done. And the driver planner, which I'll show on the following slide, really allows you to see which drivers have the relevant amount of time. A lot of companies struggle and send a driver to do a 6-hour round trip when actually they've only got 4.5 hours left on their driving time directive. And as I say, I've blanked out some names here, so this is all true and real and live data. You can see not just on the day, the week, but also the 2 weeks, how much time that driver has available to you. And imagine the power of knowing this information before you send them out on a job. Again, it reduces your risk as an organization to put your drivers out on the road, but also reduces the driver's risk as well. Obviously, there's a lot of data and a lot of information, and I have obviously flown through it. It's a very kind of short whirlwind into what it is. But realistically, I'll kind of jump into the data analysis and how I personally look at this, and I know we coach a lot of organizations. Reactive is always driven by incidents, complaints, claims within your fleet as well. All well and good, but you do need that data to back up, kind of your side of the story or your driver's side of the story. Proactive, can be driven by the simplicity of the data. Broad overview gives an indication of risk within the fleet. Now, where I need to focus my time and attention. Trending will identify who and when these risks are most likely. Do we have a particular challenge on a Friday afternoon when everyone wants to get home as quickly as possible for the weekend? Does it happen first thing on a Monday morning when everyone's running late? Potentially. Use this data and information to your benefit to see how you can improve your business operations. And then reporting allows you to deliver specific feedback to your drivers and your team. And what I mean by that is actually the powerful engine behind a lot of this kind of the broad brushstroke or the broad overview and the trending can really give you specifics on an incident. This is all well and good, and reducing risks on the road is always superb. You have the data, you do a bit of analysis, and then up pops an idea. Now, all of these ideas and all of this analysis is fantastic from a risk perspective, but it's also really, really good for the operational efficiencies. And that is things like your fuel efficiencies. You reduce your harsh driving incidents, your speeding incidents, and the way your vehicles are being driven, you're going to reduce your fuel. You reduce those harsh driving and poor driving behaviours out on the road, you're going to reduce your wear and tear. Now, it's something that I can't quote on, and I don't know how well your fleets and your drivers are performing out on the road, but it's something that we are reported on every single day and every week by our customers. Is actually by monitoring this, the reduction in tire wear, dings, dents, scratches, scrapes on the vehicles, is huge. So those small things really, really do add up. last and most importantly, from a claim perspective, certainly a reduction on that side of things as well. Just because you can identify these risks, you improve on the areas that you need improvement, and then off you pop. You're in a much better place as an organization. As I say, data analysis all the way through the idea, or through an idea in terms of how to improve that as an organization. At that point, I'm going to leave it open to questions and answers. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions and queries about not just how we, what we do and how we do it, but also ideas that we've had and how customers have implemented this solution. I'll leave it out there. Please fire away. Any questions you've got, fire them now.
Good afternoon. This section of the webinar covers pre and post crash analysis techniques, and it will give only an overview of what is a rather large topic. My purpose is to show that quite a simple, straightforward investigation can provide information that's valuable and that may help not only to suggest causes for a crash, but also to identify opportunities for reducing the chances of others occurring. I'll move through the presentation quite quickly today, but I believe it will be available to download and there will be opportunities to submit questions later. I'll start by looking at contributory factors to crashes, because understanding what these factors can be helps you to know what to look for when investigating and also what to concentrate on when thinking about prevention. I'll also introduce some practical aspects of investigation, and I hope to show that although effective professional collision investigators should be properly qualified and experienced, some fairly basic training can allow you to do some investigating yourself. So starting with some definitions, road crashes are often referred to as accidents, and indeed the government publishes what it refers to as accident data. The Oxford English Dictionary defines an accident as an unfortunate incident that happens unexpectedly and unintentionally, typically resulting in damage or injury. In the context of road usage, we may argue that the concept of fortune should not be included as a factor because road crashes always have a cause. And although crashes may be unintentional, we could also say they're not unexpected, with, for example, over 350 injury accidents, as the government refers to them, per day being reported in 2017. Our hosts break off with this view that crashes are not chance events and that they are preventable. Part of the process of preventing them is investigation, which requires information about the crash, both to be collected and to be evaluated, and this can then feed back into prevention. So in order for a crash or a collision to happen, a number of factors may be involved, and these factors can be broken down into three categories: human, environmental, and vehicle factors. Environmental factors might be the weather or the road surface, and vehicle factors may be a mechanical fault. Human factors can include distraction, fatigue, or being in a hurry, just to give a few examples. It may be that several factors have come together just at the wrong time. So, for example, a driver who is not concentrating and has to brake suddenly to avoid a collision may not crash on a day when the road is dry, but may skid into the car in front when it's wet. So causations of crashes can overlap. This graph represents data collected by the police and published by the UK government. It shows a number of contributory factors to crashes as determined by the police, and also the severity of those crashes. And you may be surprised to see that vehicle defects make up only a very small portion of the total. Already we're getting clues as to where we should concentrate our efforts when trying to prevent crashes. The E's, the V's and the H's on the graph indicate whether environmental, vehicle or human factors were involved. Clearly there are a lot of H's. We can also see that driver error or reaction is by far the highest column. And incidentally, the sum of all the contributory factors comes to over 100% because often there is more than one contributory factor in a crash. Employers and fleet managers can influence the risk their drivers are at by looking at measures that can have an effect on them, such as driving in the early hours, being expected to answer the phone at all times, not being allowed enough time for the journey, having to take routes through built-up areas, or being expected to drive to the office when they could work at home. So now we come on to the question of how do we actually investigate a crash. Although it can be a complex subject, some basic investigation can be done with some basic training and useful evidence can be gathered. And an investigation of an uncomplicated incident at a simple level may be perfectly good enough as part of a company internal procedure. So your investigator will need some fairly basic equipment, which I'll talk about later in a bit more detail, and an idea of what evidence they're going to look for, where they might find it. Vehicle inspections can be complex and require some specialized knowledge, but documenting damage, usually in the form of photographs, notes or sketches, can be done without being a vehicle expert. Other sources of evidence may include recordings of events such as dash cams, tachographs, CCTV, witness accounts, and background evidence such as vehicle logbooks and other records. So moving on to some practicalities, thinking about what you may need to do at a collision scene and being prepared for what you might find may save you a wasted trip, and it may also mean that you don't miss or lose evidence. This might seem obvious, but you do need to know exactly where a collision happened before you go and have a look, and you're wasting your time if you go to the wrong place. You should get as much information as possible to allow you to pinpoint the location, and also the directions of travel of the vehicles are useful. Try to go at a time that will make the inspection easier and safer. There may be less traffic at certain times of day, and also consider whether you should go at all. You would not be taking measurements on this road, for example. The equipment you will need for a scene visit can be fairly rudimentary, and I've made some suggestions here, but it should certainly include a camera. You don't need to be an expert photographer, but do try to take images that reproduce what you see in front of you without any special effects. The easiest way to make measurements over the distances that may be involved is with a measuring wheel, and having a crayon or road chalk to make marks on the road or cones to show positions in photographs is useful. Examining vehicles in detail is more specialized, but that doesn't stop anyone from taking photographs. I can't emphasize enough now that there are risks associated with both road inspections and vehicle inspections, and you should always assess these risks when deciding what to do and how to do it. Wearing high vis, for example, can help, but it does not make you invulnerable. And sadly, even people who work on the roads professionally become casualties. And I suggest that specific training should be considered for anyone who is going to visit collision scenes. So clearly, having an idea of what you may be looking for when you arrive at a crash scene will help prevent you overlooking something, and it might help you to have some pro forma paperwork or even just a tick list that will jog your memory. Each case will be different, and often all you are left with is an empty road. Other times there may be more to look for, and this list includes some of those things. When you arrive, make sure you're at the right place. Consider carefully where you will stop, if at all. You may have to park a little way off and walk back, or it might not be safe or legal to stop anywhere near, so of course you shouldn't do it if that's the case. There's no shame in getting back to the office and saying it was too risky to stop, because nobody wants you to become an additional casualty. If the crash was serious enough for the police to have been to it, they may have left evidence of their examination. For example, the paint marks in this photo, which highlight the position and direction of gouges made in the road surface. Don't worry too much if you see marks and don't know what they mean or why they are there, but it might help later if you do record them. As well as taking photos, consider making a sketch, and I'll talk a bit more about this later. So if the scene is still relatively fresh, then you may find things like this. Skid marks, they're not so common these days with vehicles having ABS. Fluid leaks, which can show both where the collisions happened and where vehicles came to rest. There may be a trail of fluid. Gouges in the road made by parts of vehicles that contacted it. Evidence of where curbs were hit by tires, wheels, or other vehicle parts, and marks on the verges where vehicles have run off the road. It's much more likely, I think, that you will go to a crash scene long after the event and there will be nothing much left to see. However, I do believe it's likely that you will learn something by going to a collision scene, as it can give you a better understanding of what happened. So turning back to sketches, your sketch doesn't have to be a work of art, as you can see, but even a little information can prove to be useful later. And this made-up example here shows how just a small number of measurements that might help in this case, for example, in assessing what the visibility was like from this junction. If you are considering visibility, and usually you will be, then try to imagine the viewpoints of those involved and which features might be relevant. When taking measurements, it's good practice to work from features that are not likely to change, such as curbs or lampposts. Photographs are usually invaluable, and I suggest you take lots of them. It's better than not taking enough. If you take photographs in sequences as you walk around scenes, then it helps you to work out what they are later, for example, on the approach to this junction, but don't get so engrossed in what you're doing that you get run over. Taking notes of what you've photographed may help too when it comes to putting it all together into a report at a later date. And before you leave a scene, I would suggest you do check you've actually got the photos that you expected to, which might save you a trip back there again later. This slide shows another sequence of photographs on the approach to a collision scene and shows a driver's eye view from the road, which may be quite different from the view you have from the pavement. As ever, you must be very aware of your own safety and that of other road users. As an alternative to photos, you could make a dash cam video using an assistant in your vehicle if necessary. Turning to vehicles, first thing to do usually is to take a set of photos from all around the vehicle with it filling the frame of each photo. Taking photos which show that a part of a vehicle was not damaged might be just as important as showing the damage, so try to record all of the vehicle. It's a common mistake when photographing vehicles to concentrate on the damaged areas and just to take close-up shots, in which case it can be hard to tell where these are and what you're looking at. So it's difficult to tell what we're looking at here unless the damage is also shown in context. So if you're going to take close-up shots of damage, then start with a view that shows where it is and then go in closer. And again, a sequence might help. The last stage of your investigation will be putting together all of your evidence and then trying to draw some conclusions from it. And after you've made your examinations and collected all of your available information, you need to decide what to do with it, and you may need to produce some kind of report. If you're a fleet manager, you may already have a reporting system and a format to use, but I've suggested some things to consider when writing your report, with the overarching principle that your conclusions must be based on facts. It may be that you don't have enough information and you're not able to draw any firm conclusions, and that can be a perfectly valid outcome. You should not expect to always be able to conclusively work out what happened. You should also consider whether you or your organization have the expertise to carry out an investigation and then to draw conclusions from a particular incident, and whether you should engage an expert to help you. In some cases, that might be more appropriate. So I'll conclude by saying that there are some simple steps that can be taken that can be invaluable in documenting and understanding what happens in traffic collisions. Having a predefined process to follow can help you investigate as a fleet manager, or can provide information to an insurer, for example, or to an expert who may then be able to reconstruct a collision in some detail. This may help you to learn from the incident and to put measures in place to stop it from happening again. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning. My name is Richard Hill, Managing Director of Driver Metrics. I'm delighted to join you this morning to have the opportunity to share some thoughts in relation to how we can monitor driver behaviour and how we can use the data to implement targeted coaching interventions. But before we consider how we can monitor driver behaviour, I think we firstly need to be able to understand and measure driver behaviour. There are a number of behavioural factors that have been scientifically proven to be directly linked to crash involvement. These include things such as driver fatigue, aggression, and the stresses associated with driving for work. And these factors can manifest themselves in many different ways. As we've seen from the previous slide, there are several contributory factors in any single crash, but the critical factor is, of course, the behaviour of the driver. One obvious method of monitoring driver behaviour is the use of in-vehicle technology, such as telematics. But according to a recent survey, almost 20% of UK fleets are using telematics. But as we can see, the main reason and motivation for investing in this technology varies dramatically. And more worryingly, driver safety isn't the main priority. Typically, telematic systems record selected driving events, such as harsh acceleration, late braking, and of course, speeding, which provides us with some very useful data, albeit this is after the event. So we know that when used on its own, this data provides limited insight into the underlying behaviours and of course the motives of your drivers. So let's remind ourselves, very importantly, that telematics will tell you what's happened, where it happened, and what time of day it happened. But most importantly, it won't explain why it happened. So how can we use this data effectively? Well, by combining telematics data with an effective driver risk assessment, such as driver metrics, not only can you identify the highest risk drivers in your fleet, but you can also begin to understand the specific behaviours that are contributing to the risks of each driver. And this in turn enables you to implement interventions that are tailored to the specific needs of your drivers. So now you're in possession of a wealth of data, but what you do with that data is critical to the success of your strategy. We would suggest you consider the following approach. Firstly, avoid the blame culture and focus on avoidability, not fault. Secondly, encourage your drivers to reflect on their driving and to consider the consequences of their actions. Next, generate clear learning outcomes for both business and for the driver. And lastly, implement tailored interventions to prevent a reoccurrence of the event in the future. So by using your telematics data, along with a clear understanding of the motives that contribute to an individual's driving style, will enable you to deliver targeted and highly effective interventions. Let's be honest, in most cases, your fleet drivers have sufficient skills to drive safely, but they choose not to, primarily due to a combination of work and, of course, personal pressures. So therefore, any successful intervention needs to be relevant to the individual and needs to focus on the behaviours and not skills. Typical interventions could include e-learning modules that are designed to address risky behaviours that have been highlighted by the risk assessment, group workshops that utilise the group dynamic to influence and change driver behaviours, and finally, one-to-one coaching that's based on the driver's telematics data and driver metrics report. So we've looked at how we can monitor driver behaviour and how we can use the data, and lastly, delivering targeted coaching interventions. But what does this look like in reality? Well, as you can see here, we've got 3 fleet drivers, all of which have been identified via telematics for harsh braking. But as you can clearly see, the reason for their harsh braking is different for each individual and therefore needs to be treated accordingly. So to maximise the effectiveness of your programme, we would recommend that you use a suitable system to identify and change driver behaviour, and then use your telematics system to monitor the day-to-day driver performance. So as you've seen in this short presentation, used in isolation, telematics has a limited impact, but by combining the data and using it in conjunction with an effective risk assessment can prove to be a highly effective strategy. That concludes this morning's presentation. Please feel free to visit our website at www.drivermetrics.com, where you'll see a variety of case studies that have highlighted the benefits of an effective risk management strategy and utilisation of telematics data. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. We've now come to the end of the formal presentations, and it is time for our Q&A session. So first, I'd like to thank everyone who engaged in today's poll. So as you can see on the screen, are you gathering and analysing data on every road incident involving your vehicles? 50% said yes, 33% said no, and 17% said don't know. So I'd now like to just welcome Gary Taylor from Verizon Connect. Hi Gary, what are your views on this?
Hi Sarah, thank you very much for that. Yeah, if I'm brutally honest, it's really interesting feedback to know that only 50% are actually kind of gathering and also analysing that data. It's not too dissimilar to organisations we work with on a day-to-day basis, if I'm brutally honest. And that is where kind of telematics and other platforms as well become inherently useful to not only reduce risks, but also kind of confirm what's happened. Now, a lot of organisations we speak to get claims purely on the basis they've got a sign-written van. So somebody thinks, I've seen that vehicle, driving down the road. That must have been the vehicle that's clipped it. And companies are very quick to actually pay out on some of these claims just on the basis they don't want the bad name, when actually utilising some data behind it is so useful and can actually quash a lot of that. First and foremost, those that aren't using gathering or analysing data, my question would be, why not? I think it's inherently useful and very valuable information for an organisation. Those that don't know, I would go and from a personal perspective, I would go to either the fleet team or the people in your organization that kind of look after that department and say, what can we do and how can we do it? I'd be more than welcome, have a conversation with anybody about that. But I find it really, really interesting. 50% of attendees to this, certainly not gathering or not knowing that they're gathering and analysing data. I think that's a huge number of vehicles out on the road or companies who just aren't utilising everything at their fingertips. So yeah, really interesting feedback actually.
Brilliant, thank you for your thoughts on that. What kind of data do you think people should be prioritising then for fleets to gather about their drivers?
First and foremost, driving behaviour. It's the one thing that I go to straight off the bat. The reason for that is very, very quickly you can kind of trend and see exactly where challenges or potential challenges lie within your fleet. Looking at one individual day is never the right thing to do. Individuals have bad days. Individuals are running late. If you utilize this data over a longer period of time, you're going to collect a lot more information about your guys without being sat in the car next to them. Are they somebody that absolutely hammers their foot down every single time they pull away from a traffic light? Are they somebody that absolutely, it runs late and is leaving to everything to the last minute before they get on the road? That information will allow you to guide your people that are out on the road, and maybe you don't see them very often, which certainly guide them to be able to perform better on the road, and reduce that risk. If you've got somebody over a month-long period who has, let's say, 100 poor driving behaviour incidents, and you've got somebody that has 10, we know where the risk is, right? The person with 100 is significantly more likely to have an incident out on the road than the person with 10 over the same period of time. Focus your time and attention on those that need it most. Protect your business, your brand, and your fleet as well. They are incredibly valuable assets that are sat out on the road that you're paying for. And that's probably the first port of call I would go for, is just looking at those driver behaviour. But don't just look at one element. Look at the collection. So speeding alongside the harsh driving, harsh braking, harsh cornering, and really fast acceleration. You'll be mind blown to see the impact of actually reducing all of those three things collectively.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Gary. We are also joined by Andy Price from Fleet Safety Management. Hi Andy, can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Wonderful. So the first question for you, Andy, is why are post-incident review processes uncommon among fleet organisations? Why do you think that is?
I think probably it's because they're actually quite difficult to do. The driving is quite an emotive issue, so not many of us are equipped to be able to sit down with our peers, with our colleagues, and actually have a sort of an unemotive conversation about driving. It's quite a difficult thing to do. So certainly anyone who's going to do that would need the appropriate training about how to effectively engage and discuss driving in a non-emotive issue. I think maybe as well there's perhaps people don't understand some of the benefits that you could get out of that system. All too often I see that it's very easy to blame the driver when a collision's occurred, and it's not uncommon to see organisations who've got something like a 3-strike and you're out policy. But unless you're actually looking at potentially operational management reasons about that may have contributed to that collision occurring, that's inherently an unfair process. But because it's so difficult to actually convince managers that they actually need to have that training and get the ability to have that conversation, then maybe that's what's holding people back. But to be honest, Sarah, I don't know.
That's fair. For the next question, I imagine there's possibly a long answer which you could give to this, so I'm just going to ask for a summary. Can you advise on what an effective post-incident review should look like? What would be your key top 3 things?
So without going into the detail about the questions and the areas that would need to be covered, it should be ideally done by the person's supervisor or line manager, because they're the controlling mind of that employee. It should look at all the sort of possible reasons that many of the speakers have gone through today about why the collisions occurred. Is it speed? Is it traveling too close? Is it impairment, fatigue, etc., etc.? And it should cover all the potential management reasons and operational reasons why the driver may have been driving like that. So were they under time pressures? Were the targets not being hit at the end of the month, so they were forced to make extra calls? Either unrealistic delivery targets? Whatever it is, that needs to be addressed as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time, Andy. We have now run out of time, so I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you all for attending today's webinar, which is kindly sponsored by Verizon Connect. And we hope you enjoyed it and that the webinar has equipped you with some useful information that will help you to work towards our common goal, which is, of course, safe and healthy mobility in fleets. You can view our upcoming webinars and any other events which we are running on our website, which is globalfleetchampions.org. We welcome your feedback, so please do complete our short feedback form, which will appear on your screen once the webinar ends. And if you'd like to discuss the content of today's webinar further, then please join our Global Fleet Champions LinkedIn group. You'll also receive a link to that shortly. And thank you very much again to today's presenters. Thank you to Andy and Gary for joining us for the Q&A. And again, thank you to Verizon Connect. We hope you can join us again soon and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.